Hey all, back and talking to the Void once more, this time about The Grudge, the new one. Despite it being simply called The Grudge, it is actually a reboot, sequel. It's kind of unclear on what they're going for with this one, but it's simply just called The Grudge. Though the DVD case seems to try to make you think it's called The Grudge, The Untold Chapter, as if trying to differentiate itself from the 2004 version. Okay, I've got a lot to unpack here. So, this one is I guess, in the franchise of The Grudge, or Ju-on. Ju-on The Grudge was a Japanese film and is one of my favorite horror films. It's actually, I think I could be wrong, but the second in a series of very terrifying films, all centered in about a house in Japan that has a curse on it after a very violent murder happened there, and anyone who encounters it is doomed. Then when I first saw that movie, it was one of the most nightmare-inducing movies I'd seen in a long time, and is probably my favorite Japanese horror film to this day. I encountered it just before seeing the 2004 remake, which was okay. Now, Ju-on was stylish, and though it took a second to get used to that particular style, as Ju-on was told out of order. It essentially would go to a black screen with just a name on it, then it would begin following that character until something terrible happened. Then it would go to cut to black, give another name, and start following them. Now this might then as these stories began interweaving, you got a whole tale of several different things. It jumps back and forth. Occasionally, you'll see characters interact to give you an idea on when things are happening, but it relies on you to figure out a lot about what's actually going on. And it's a very effective storytelling style. Now, the American version, it's been years since I've seen it, but I believe it did not do. It left out that particular gimmick, and probably for the worse. It and of the sequences portrayed, it actually the one I found the scariest in Ju-on didn't even make it into the American remake. Ju-on 2 was effective. The Grudge 2 wasn't bad again, but it's still, at least this time, was doing its own thing, I will say, and it was completely set apart from Ju-on 2, as it became at least trying to create its own storyline. And while The Grudge 3 was a direct-to-video and not very memorable, it again continued to at least do its own thing. Now, all the Ju-on films were rated R, while The Grudge and The Grudge 2 were both only PG-13, though it's kind of hard to go into why Ju-on is rated R. It's not a particularly bloody or violent film, but I believe it goes more into the intensity of the sequences, while The Grudge just seemed to lack that. Now we come to the 2020 version, The Grudge, and this one does have that R rating, though for more of an American reason than Ju-on did. Now, there are some things that I do like about this new version. Then this one does seem to be trying to do its own thing, which I appreciate. It's not a simple remake of The Grudge or even of Ju-on. It seems to be taking its essentially, this one film really could be set in the continuity of the American remakes, or even the Japanese version, without breaking any sort of verisimilitude. The movie does stand decently in just sliding itself in as just another incident without stepping on either series' toes. This one does actually do the shot, not quite shot out of order, but at least does something similar of having four stories that are kind of interweaving that it cuts back and forth to, ranging from the years of 2004 to 2006. So you essentially start at one cop that's begins investigating a strange case, and it keeps cutting back to those cases in a new house in America. This movie kind of posits that a woman who encountered the cursed house in Japan then came back to America and essentially set up a new cursed house after terrible things happened. the original remake of The Grudge didn't really go into that territory at all. It, in fact, was actually, for better or worse, set in Japan, making it seem almost like trying to be a shot for shot remake without actually being one and Americaning things up a bit. In fact, despite being set in Japan, that movie is primarily an English-speaking cast, and Sarah Michelle Gellar is actually staying involved in an American house over there that's cursed. Yeah. This one, however, not Ju-on 2, sorry, The Grudge 2 did have something similar about bringing the curse back to America. This one, however, does it in a way that helps differentiate itself from the Japanese versions. In the Japanese ones, the main ghost Kayako and her son Toshio are in all of the Ju-on films, as except for maybe some of the more recent spin-offs, they're more of just a side focus in it. But for the main series, they're the main antagonists. While the American version of The Grudge also keeps with Kayako, and as well as Grudge 2 and Grudge 3, it's all about the same ghost. This one, however, you see a little bit of Kayako in the beginning as she interacts with the then Mrs. I can't remember her full name, Miss Landers. And when Miss Landers brings the curse back to her family, she becomes essentially the new main ghost, and her family is the one that starts terrorizing people who enter their house. So it's essentially not being as beholden to the original source material, but in this case, I think it's a little for the better, as it's not just simply a rehash of everything we've already seen. Similar things might happen, but it's at least we're not seeing the same ghost over and over and over again. It adds a little bit to the mythology of it setting up a new haunting. Now, I do still have a few issues here. Ju-on was a slow burn and a very tense, creepy build. You would keep seeing a ghost in the background, and you'd just be waiting for something to happen for a painfully long time, and then when something finally does, it is gut-wrenching as it slowly advances. This film is very American in its take of being very in your face. A ghost will suddenly. There's a lot of jump scares, and a lot of. It doesn't take its time to build up the tension that Ju-on does. It's a lot more in your face and very bloody. There is a lot of blood in this version. Several bone protrusions. There's several fingers. Someone's blinding themselves. Someone jumping to their death and they explode on impact. This is a not subtle film at all. That said, it did have a decent degree of tension, but the scares were in a more American style than the slow burn dread of a Japanese film. It isn't a bad movie. I did enjoy this film for what it was. I will say it does a very good job of balancing the four stories as they jump back and forth for all the different haunting. It's the same haunting, but broken up into four cases, I guess. And it does a good job balancing that. It takes a second at the beginning to realize what it's doing, but even the Japanese version did that also. It took a second to get used to the style, so I'm not going to fault it here. But overall, I did enjoy the movie, but I wouldn't rank it anywhere near as good as the Japanese ones, but it's probably the best American attempt at the film thus far. I do appreciate it's not simply aping the same scares we've seen again and again, and trying something new and in a very American style, admittedly, but overall I did enjoy the movie, and it does set it up to where it could spin off into its own franchise and its own world with new ghosts. I will say I was happy to see Lin Shaye in a movie. I always enjoy seeing her from Insidious or Ouija and numerous other movies, but it's always good to see her in something again. And I was not expecting John Cho either, but he carries the movie very well. Overall, I do recommend the movie, but you have to understand what you're getting into. It's a very loud, in-your-face jump scare movie, more than the creeping, aping, insidious dread of the normal Ju-on franchise. So it's I did like it, and not as much as I was hoping to, admittedly, but the storytelling style does work here. Don't know if I have anything else to add to this one, but so I'd rank it below any of the Ju-on films I've seen, but above any of the other Grudge movies. So I'd give it a watch.